magic lantern, so you're not going to want to miss that. So let's jump right into our keynote presentation. And we could not have come up with a more appropriate person to speak about the history of Alaska resource development as we mark the 50th anniversary of the startup of the pipeline than Governor Bill Walker. Born in Fairbanks and raised in Valdez, Governor Walker almost has Alaska oil and gas in his blood. He worked on the pipeline as a teamster and as a local government official in Valdez, helping that community manage the impact of the oil terminus. He and his wife, Donna, founded a law firm focused on oil and gas, and he worked for years to try to kickstart an Alaska gas line. You'll remember in 2014, Bill and Byron Mallott were elected to the governor's office on the Alaska First Unity ticket. And unlike other governors who won't be named, Governor Walker took seriously the challenges of the state budget deficit, courageously proposing both budget cuts and taxes to balance the budget. And to question Governor Walker, we're fortunate to have our own in-house resource development expert on the history board, history and Arctic studies professor Phil Wight. Phil had a great column on the pipeline in the Daily News and the News Miner recently, and is finalizing a manuscript on the environmental history of TAPS. So please join me in welcoming Governor Bill Walker and Professor Phil Wight.
Good morning, folks. Can everybody hear me all right? Well, Governor Walker, it's a pleasure to be on stage with you here. You know, I thought we set up this chair so that you could be in the limelight. I'm not really in the limelight. This is really about you, but it's my pleasure to have you here at the University of Alaska. And love to just start off by talking about your childhood. As an environmental historian, I'm a firm believer that the environment that we grow up in shapes who we are as individuals. And so can you tell us a little bit about your family's Alaska history and where you grew up?
I can't, but before that, I want to apologize. I'd love to stay here for the next 3 days and hear all these great presentations and spend more time. I've been asked to speak at the State Pioneers Convention in Valdez tomorrow. So I will be back on the road after this south to do that. But thank you for what all you do for the history of Alaska. It's an interesting history, and I'm a bit of a history buff when it comes to Alaska, so thank you very much for what you do.
And Governor, I'm sorry to interrupt. We're just getting the signal that if you can move your mic a little closer, maybe we can double check that it's on. We're also live streaming this on Zoom, so we have folks who are very interested in this conversation all over the state and the country.
Okay, my background, you're correct. I was
Can't have technology without having some technological difficulties. All right, so we got to move into the stand-up comedy part of this presentation. I'll tell you guys, I'll tell you a story the first time that I met Governor Walker, which was, he was up here in Fairbanks and we were getting together to talk shop for this conference. He was nice enough to meet with me at Alaska Coffee Roasters. And within the first 5 minutes of the conversation, I'm so excited here, and he's telling this great story about a college reunion and being on a tour bus between Seward and Anchorage, and the tour bus driver, operator, person giving the tour had been in Alaska for 2 weeks. And the governor said, I just wanted to pay that person to stop talking. And I'm kind of outraged for him, and I talk with my hands. You'll see this as part of this presentation. And unfortunately, within 5 minutes of meeting the governor, I proceeded to knock over my 20-ounce Americano all over his lap, all over his legal pad and his cell phone. And I will never forget that, but he was cool as a cat, and appreciate you, Governor.
Well, thank you. Yeah, that was amazing. I'm riding up with somebody, and he's trying to explain to everybody about Alaska, and he says there's something to do on with these things, and it's called hoop fishing. You know, it was painful. It was the worst 2 hours of my life of riding with this guy and whatnot. But anyway, well, my background, I'm Fairbanks born. My dad was in the Alaskan Scouts in the Aleutians and part of Kastner's Cutthroats. And my mom was in Washington, D.C. as part of the White House press corps when she was 15. And they advertised for someone, you know, they needed people coming on a project. They couldn't tell them where they were going to go, but bring all the warm clothes you have. And they landed in Fairbanks, and so she worked on the building of the Alcan Highway. So that was sort of and they met on a train from Fairbanks to Anchorage, and there was a snow slide at Denali Park, and for 4 days they were stopped, and there were, I don't know, several thousand soldiers, and there were very few women on the train. My mother was one of the women, and my dad was one of the guys, whatnot. So anyway, that's how they met, and my dad was involved in construction in Fairbanks. They had Arctic Block Construction. He and Con Frank did that together back in the mid to late 40s, and ultimately continued to move south the Delta for about 7 years, and then on to Valdez from there to build. My dad was a builder, and so my brother Bob, who was here, who attended University of Alaska Fairbanks, we became carpenters at a very young age, and we still are. We're going to build another building when we get done with this tour of Alaska, and we have a company called A Couple Old Guys Construction. We have over 150 years of experience in our team, and there's only two of us. So,
Fantastic. Well, speaking of building things, you know, you were in Valdez at quite a tumultuous moment, you know, living through the largest recorded earthquake in U.S. history. What was that like, and how did that change your trajectory?
well, and I'm looking at my classmate Marty Rutherford here. We were in the 7th grade, I think, at that time, and it was a little surreal. You know, we didn't have a lot of communication then. We didn't have TV and whatnot, and so you didn't really understand the full magnitude until you started listening to the reports coming in. But of course, Valdez lost about 35 people on the dock, and many of them were from Fairbanks, just because of our transportation connection and whatnot. So it was something you never forget. Just because anytime that you can always tell sort of those that went through the 64 quake and start to shake a little bit. We went a little faster than others, just because we have that sort of DNA about what happened on March 27th. And so and what I marvel about is within 30 days, and I researched this at one point, of when that quake took place, the city council voted unanimously to move the town. That's a big decision. I mean, that's a huge decision, but they just things were happening very, very quickly. And I have to say, the government came in to help us, and Fairbanks came in to solve our problems. And Fairbanks, they sent us down to a city manager. They sent us, legal help. Fairbanks just really unbelievable, all that Fairbanks did for Valdez after the quake. In fact, because of Fairbanks' gratitude, it saved Bill Egan's life. And here's how it saved his life. Fairbanks at one point said, we need to have a party in Valdez. And boy, Valdez, all the guys, we had to leave. Marty and I, we were all kicked out of town, the kids were, but I think Marty actually came back, I think. But anyway, they had Fairbanks said, let's pack up a 40-foot van with a bunch of food and booze and go to Valdez and just have a party. This was like probably a month after the quake. So they did. And Valdez, steaks and fine wines and booze. And Bill Egan came in to do some presentation with the flew in on the National Guard flight. He was scheduled to fly out, He said, a party, booze, what? And so he said he stayed. And that plane is the one that crashed when it left Valdez, and everybody died on the plane. And so, I credit Fairbanks with, I can't credit it enough with what Fairbanks did. Now, when the flood came in '67, we felt badly. Tom Gilson, a friend of mine, and I did come up to help, but the whole town wanted to come to Fairbanks to help, but we were busy trying to move a town and trying to do all that and whatnot. But it really showed the connection between Fairbanks and Valdez, and I get a bit emotional talking about Fairbanks just because of my memory of what they did for Valdez after the quake.
That solidarity is good to remember.
Yeah.
And then on a personal basis, you talked about, in our conversation, you talked about how that earthquake helped make you fearless, not towards natural disasters, but in the wake of losing so much. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think when we saw, what we had to do to move the town. I mean, most people didn't have mortgages in the old town. Just because you buy a house for a couple $100 and wasn't that big of a deal. When you move and get a new house for roughly $20,000, that's a big deal. And so I saw people making hard decisions, difficult decisions. Some when the quake stopped, they left town. We never saw them again. They just never came back. And that was fine. That was their decision and whatnot. But so I saw a town that really had to grapple with how are we going to survive. It's about 700 people in Valdez at that time. And so I saw people making really tough decisions, and I think that was sort of ingrained in me that, when there's a problem, you have to solve it. When there's a problem, you have to have a plan to solve it. And so I think that affected me, in a very significant way.
Absolutely. So we're spending a lot of time at this conference talking about the 70th anniversary of the Constitutional Convention, which, as we all know, took place a stone's throw from here on campus in the winter of '55 and '56. And I know you were young during those days, during both the Constitutional Convention and the Statehood Act, but I'm hoping you can share some remembrances about what statehood meant to you and your family. As a historian, I think about the political project of statehood being so much about keeping our fair share in the state, living through things like what the constitutional framers called the Kennecott syndrome, right? All the wealth of Kennecott, pure copper being extracted from the state, probably about $2 billion in today's money, and so little remaining for the residents of the state. But the project about statehood was about keeping the wealth here. And we're also very interested in sustainable development, right? We had witnessed what happened with our fisheries. So I'm wondering if you can kind of reflect upon what statehood meant to you, and were these ideas around fair share and sustainability, sustainable development, what did those mean to you and your family?
Well, at the time of the statehood, that's quite a large span, but we lived in Delta, and our folks had a newspaper. It's called Walker's Weekly. We would print it. My mother would write it. She worked for the Newsminer for years for Bill Snedden back in the 40s, and so she had that background. So they had a newspaper. So they were promoting it as best as they could. I remember hearing my dad on the phone with Bob Baker in Kotzebue. They're arguing about statehood. Bob was not in favor of statehood, and my dad was for it. So they had that healthy discussion, lively discussion about the pros and cons of statehood. And of course, the goal was if the Constitution was trying to convince Washington that we should become a state. And then a plane load of Alaskans, flew to Washington to lobby for that. And I have to confess, as a 9-year-old in Delta, I wasn't for statehood. And the reason is that my little group of a gang of buddies had heard the rumor that if we became a state, we couldn't have fireworks. And that was a non-starter for me. I never confessed to my parents that, but if we couldn't have fireworks, there's no reason to become a state. But so it was we did watch. It was really a matter of being able to have control. We watched, companies coming in and on the fisheries, and they were not certainly concerned about sustainability. They were concerned about their bottom line. I understand that. So it was timber, it was fisheries, there was a lot of things. We just wanted to have control of this great state that we lived in and whatnot. So, and it wasn't it wasn't a unanimous vote in Congress, obviously. And one of the justifications, because some of them came to Alaska afterwards and weren't particularly welcomed, that voted against, and they said we voted against because Alaska didn't have the kind of infrastructure that all the other states have. And that's one of the reasons that we ended up with the owner of the resources. They said that you need to live off the resources. And we said, yeah, that makes sense to us. And so that's why I believe we're the only state in the nation that actually owns the resources here as an owner state.
Absolutely. Well, that's a perfect segue to, we get statehood, we make the very wise decision to select the lands around where Prudhoe Bay is. Of course, Prudhoe Bay is discovered in late 67, early 68. And, you were in high school when ARCO discovered Prudhoe Bay. And many Alaskans today don't remember what that was like, both the discovery of oil and then the frenetic rush to try to build a pipeline and monetize that resource. Can you give us a sense of what those moments were like for you?
Well, remember, that was not that many years after the earthquake. So we were still trying to kind of rebuilding, certainly the parts of the state that suffered from the quake. So that was an amazing announcement when that came through. And yes, I think we were juniors in high school, 68. And the way, so we followed it closely. We also followed closely the voyage of the Manhattan as it left Prudhoe Bay, headed for New York, as one of the options of how to get the oil out of Alaska. Interestingly enough, fast forward when I was in office, I got a communication from the grandson of the captain of the Manhattan who wanted to take gas off the slope directly rather than a pipeline. I thought, boy, the acorns don't fall far from the tree. This is and whatnot. So we watched that closely to see what was going to happen. But my recollection of why Valdez was selected is three gentlemen: John Kelty, Marty's dad, George Gilson, who was the mayor at the time, and Bill Wyatt. The three of them bundled up a bunch of maps and went to Anchorage and went to the hotel where all the oil folks were staying and cornered them and rolled out the maps on the floor of Valdez and whatnot and said, here's some land here, here's this, here's that. And that's, it wasn't a lot of studying going on as far as a decade or two of studying, and they were in a hurry. And so that was, whether that was a tipping point for Valdez, I don't know. I know that there was some push to bring it to Cook Inlet, and it ended up going down to Valdez, which was a great thing.
Yeah. Well, I'll jump ahead to one of my questions then, because that's a perfect segue. So, Valdez becomes unquestionably the epicenter of the Trans-Alaska pipeline system. The pipeline was explicitly routed to Valdez because it was the shortest path and offered a deep water port, right? The owners at the time said, we want to pick this because it will accommodate the deepest vessels afloat in the world in the late 1960s. And of course, Valdez and its citizens experienced firsthand the trauma and the frenzy of the Exxon Valdez oil spill, and will forever share the name of Alaska's worst environmental disasters. Not only did you grow up in Valdez, you became very involved in public life in Valdez. I believe am I accurate in saying that you still have the title of the youngest mayor ever of Valdez?
That might be Bill Egan. I'm not sure was, but
one of the youngest mayors of Valdez. You served as city attorney, city councilor. You helped ensure that the city received its fair share of taxes from the considerable value of taps once the pipeline was constructed. And so what did you see about how the realization of this pipeline transformed Valdez?
So let me step back a little bit to the beginning of the construction. My brother and I had worked a long time for our dad, and the only thing we'd never seen was a paycheck, which was fine. That's just the way it worked, and that was fine. And I remember so well when I got one of it was a correction to my introduction. I was a 341 laborers first, and there was a jurisdictional battle that caused me to be a Teamster for a short period of time. I went back, and so I remember well. I've received a number of diplomas and degrees in my educational career, but I'll never forget when I received my dispatch from Labor 341 Jim Robinson. When he handed that to me, I looked at that, and I can still visualize it as we sit here. I knew that was a ticket to a very different future by having that. And boy, when I got my first paycheck, wow. I said, we're going to be eating one of these every month? They said, no, this is every week. It was amazing. I'm loading pipe. Our shift was 7 in the morning till midnight. And because of the demurrage on the ship and whatnot. And so, and I was right out of high school at that point. And so we're making more money than we'd ever seen before. And then to complicate that even more, they dropped the drinking age to 19 in Alaska. Now that was the challenge because here we could suddenly go in the bars and all that. It was unbelievable. And then they had to coat the pipe because of the delay. It was rusting. So then we went to work for Surf Coat, coating the pipe, whatnot. So, we had a lot of interaction on that pipe before it finally, left Valdez and hauled to Fairbanks, whatnot. So yeah, it was. Everybody knew that this was. I mean, the timing was such that we were just in the right place at the right time to take full advantage of this opportunity. So that was the sort of the beginning of the process. And come home from college in the summer and spring break. Classmates would go to Cancun for spring break. I'd go to Valdez and get a dispatch and go right back to work. And so it was. I'm forever indebted to for certainly the Labor 341, Teamsters 959, and ultimately in the Carpenters 1281 as a journeyman carpenter. So I saw all sort of building the camps, and it was and the best thing I think that the pipeline did for me personally is it brought my wife to Alaska. She worked out of Glen Allen camp and ultimately came to Valdez as the Valdez's first Parks and Recreation director. She was 21. And she could either go back to San Diego, where she had graduated from school. She's actually from Hawaii, or in Valdez, she could become a Parks and Recreation director. And so that's what she did. And she and Marty worked together, and so that was easy to remember the number of anniversaries because we got married a few months after oil came in Valdez in '77. So yeah, that was Oil In was a party that I've never seen before. It was really, they talk about dancing in the streets. There were two bands on top of the club bar, and it was just unbelievable excitement.
Oh, I bet.
Yeah.
Well, I'm also really impressed that both you and your dad, I think, faced some of the steepest odds in terms of competition for women between World War II and the pipeline.
That's true. Yeah, I think
something in the family blood.
I think Dave Norton's here. He's I think there were how many thousand people in Glen Allen camp and that you ran and so yeah, I was very fortunate that to be that lucky one. So yeah.
Sure. And can you say a little bit? So the pipeline's completed. You get married. I love how the personal and the historical stories intertwine there. And then you make a life for yourself, a public life in Valdez. And can you say a little bit about Valdez becomes the epicenter of this system in good ways, in complicated ways. And so many folks, there had been so much wealth produced by this project, but then of course, Valdez is in a position where it needs to make sure that it is looking out for the interests of its citizens. What was that like on the ground for you? And can you talk a little bit about some of those early years and maybe even the TAPS valuation case, if you wanted to get into that?
Well, I mean, we were certainly very fortunate to have the terminus in Valdez. I mean, because what it did for our community, we were able to build, the Civic Center and other infrastructure. Just for the record, I was not the mayor when they built the grain silos. I had moved on, and when they would build an infrastructure in Valdez, they always put a plaque out there of who was the mayor and the council members. They did that on everything except the grain silos, and so my name is on the dock. And so when you look at the dock, you assume that's all together, whatnot, and it wasn't. But anyway, so we were able to do a lot of great things, some beautiful schools, just some great infrastructure that was sorely needed. So that was very, very exciting. We started to become concerned. My good friend Tom Gilson was a finance director. I mean, that's a sort of a situation in Valdez. You go up, there, and usually if you want to, higher education, you go somewhere else. So I grew up there. I became the city attorney, and Marty was the assistant city manager, Parks and Recreation director, did everything for the city. My friend Tom was another classmate was the finance director. So our class sort of, had opportunities because of that. So, but over time, we sort of started to see the revenue dropping like by 13% one year, I know. because the value was dropping on the value of the oil pipeline. So we started looking into it and looking at the process of how it was valued, and it was valued then with a boat ride on Lake Washington, and the state revenue administration would go down to Seattle, and they would go on this boat ride with the owners, and they go out and have a great time, great dinner, and and by the time they got back ashore, they had arrived at the value. Didn't seem like a very technical due process kind of valuation process. So we sort of started raising our hands a bit to say, you should at least have that in Alaska. You should at least have the process take place in Alaska. And so then they did. We still couldn't be involved in it. And so we would wait in the hallway like expectant parents in a hospital to, when they come out, and they would say what the value is. And then they'd say you have 30 days to appeal. You know, that's pretty tough climb, whatnot. So over time, and then we associated with the Fairbanks North Star Borough and the North Slope Borough, and we sort of got together and said, what can we do? And then from there on, we did challenge and made a significant change in the valuation of it. And you know, it was sort of a bit of an eye opener to me in the process of sort of how things work and how things didn't work and whatnot. And so and you know, I'm a huge advocate and fan of the oil industry, but more so I'm an Alaskan and wanted to make sure that we were being dealt with appropriately.
Absolutely. Well, I'm gonna deviate from this, because if it's just up to me, you know, we dive into TAP's politics and we talk about the tariff, but it's first thing in the morning. We don't want to put people to sleep here. So maybe we can talk about some lessons learned from TAPs. And I'm thinking both lessons, you know, we are looking out and we are looking at the prospect of a gas pipeline right now, right? So that's a big question. You know, what lessons should we learn from the construction of TAPs as we are thinking about the prospect of that pipeline?
Well, I think one thing from TAPs that and I've used this as an exhibit several times in the TAPs litigation. When Conoco left Alaska, the quote from the president, Archie Dunham, was he said, "We hate to leave Alaska, but we lose all the value in our resource, the oil they find, using infrastructure that they don't own." It was all being at that time the tariff was you know 20 times what it is today. You know, it really wasn't a level playing field. So when Conoco left for that reason, ultimately they came back, thankfully, and then became ConocoPhillips. The lesson I saw from that is that when I say the only company that left, it was not because of anything the state was doing. It's just that they couldn't make enough money on their risk because by the time it went through all the infrastructure. So that was sort of the lesson I saw. And I spent some time in Norway some years ago and sort of went over there to look at, you know, I think Senate President was there as well. So just sort of see how they did it. And you know, I'm not a real finger pointer about, you know, they should have done this, should have done that. But I do kind of try to learn from someone else who's doing it differently and why they did it. And there, it's very different. I think that the state had ownership of the infrastructure and sort of had a rate base for it, would have been better than the situation. I mean, we couldn't have at the time, most likely, it's because of the financial situation. But I was concerned when companies have left because of the you know, rather than using the existing facilities on the slope, they have to build their own facilities right next to it. Right. And so I think the state would have been better served if we could have retained some ownership of that.
So ownership. So AGDC owns what, 25% of the new gas line project. So we've certainly learned that lesson. What else should we learn from TAPs?
Well, I think that the I was very concerned with the duty to develop, because on one particular area, Point Thompson, there's a plan of development you have to do every year, a POD, and say, what are you going to develop this year? And then I think they had done 23 plans of development, and some of them were multiple years, so about 30 years of development, saying, this year we're really going to develop it. And then it rolled over and rolled over. So I finally did the uncomfortable thing is I brought litigation against the state um, to force Exxon to develop Point Thompson, because we knew it was sitting on, you know, massive natural gas, and it should be developed or taken back, whatnot. So, but in that trial, my witness, one witness was Vic Fisher. I enjoyed. You could ask him when you wrote the Constitution, one of the signers, what did you actually mean by the Section 8, and also Governor Hickel was one of my witnesses in that trial, and so ultimately that was resolved, and they did develop Point Thompson, and so it's you kind of had to push, you know. I mean, sitting on the resources and not developing them was really not the plan that we wanted.
Sure.
So sometimes you had to do some uncomfortable things to get it done, and I didn't score any points, I don't think, with Exxon. But later I visited Point Thompson when I was in office, and it was interesting to, you know, see the development that took place, the pipeline, you know, over to Prudhoe and Point Thompson and whatnot. So
Yeah, fascinating. How about from an environmental perspective? I mean, I think everybody in this room knows about the fierce contestation of the pipeline in the late 60s and early 70s, you know, the holdups because of the National Environmental Policy Act, the delay that actually produced a much better pipeline than would have come about from that. But I also think about things like Exxon Valdez and the regulation of tankers. What environmental lessons should we learn from the construction of TAPS?
you know, I think and I was one of the founding members of charter members of the Prince William Sound Regional Citizens Advisory Council, and served as its president for a couple of terms. I think the lesson really is you need to engage the local community, the local, you know, wherever you're going to do something, have a citizens group there, not necessarily as that can veto something, but can provide meaningful input, and help fund that citizens group. I went to Bob Malone of the chairman of the owners committee for Alaska. I took myself and Margie Johnson from Cordova to Sullenville, Scotland, after the oil spill, to show us what they have done over there. And they have a citizens group over there that RCAC was modeled after. And so we got to meet with them and sort of learn from them as far as what they do. A couple of things I learned from them in Sullenville. One, he said we wouldn't, here we would not let there to be an Alaska as such, because who's Alaska? Because there's 32 owners of the infrastructure, and everybody has to have a patch on. They rotate. When we were there, it was a BP patch. The employees had BPs, and they would rotate that. And they said their negotiations really would culminate on issues of value and those kinds of things. When the stock market there's talk to be an impact, I'll put it that way, and that was sort of their leverage. So he said, when you go with an independent, who's Alaska, you know, and I think the world of Alaska, my wife worked there for years, and then, you know, Tom Barrett's a close friend, and a lot of good people there. But the structure, they said they wouldn't have allowed that because they didn't have much leverage if it was somebody other than that.
Interesting. So you need basically a publicly traded company, and you can't have Alaska doesn't actually own the pipeline, right? It operates on behalf of its owners. So very important to have transparency, perhaps a publicly traded company, and not let a kind of front organization be in charge of some of the operations.
Yeah. So there was that. You know, I'm not saying we need to become Norway or need to become, you know, Sullenville, but I tend to, you know, look and see what lessons are learned, so that, you know, after the oil spill, you know, we probably have the safest oil transit now in the world with SERVs, and that was put in place. And I know it's after the, you know, the horses out of the barn, so to speak, but still, so a lot was learned from that experience and whatnot, and it was certainly not a pleasant experience for anybody involved. But there were a lot of lessons learned, and I think that others are now, perhaps, I mean, our environmental standards in some areas are the highest in the country. I mean, I think we're the only state that requires a oil spill contingency plan every time you drill a well, on every well, whatnot. So we have things in place now that we didn't have in place in the past, and so I think we have learned. But my takeaway is that if the public is involved early on, not we're doing. You have 3 minutes to talk about what we're going to do. That doesn't really quite work. And so if you have, I mean, my friends like, Stan Stevens was certainly a founder of Prince Edward Sound RCAC, and after the oil spill, he sat down with Exxon in a number and said, "We think this oil is going to go to Kodiak," and they said, "No, it's not possible." He said, "I've been on this water a long time. I think it's going to go to Kodiak," and as Senate President Stevens knows, it did, unfortunately. So they didn't. There really wasn't a place for local input in situations like that, and no one knows the local area better than the local residents.
Absolutely.
So I think that sometimes it's stepped over on decision making.
Yeah, I want to come back to this later because this will bring us up to the present moment. But I do worry as a historian that often we are most vigilant when something has just happened, and young folks now don't remember the Exxon Valdez, and we have created a safer system, but I worry about complacency. I worry about people forgetting some of these lessons. So I appreciate you bringing those to the fore. Maybe we can shift gears a little bit and talk about sovereignty, very broadly defined. In order to construct TAPS, which, to be clear, I think still is the most expensive private industrial project in human history. I mean, this was just a Herculean undertaking. It really required a reorientation of federal policy on two specific avenues. One was the passage of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, and the other was the testing of this new law, which is called the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969, or NEPA, the Magna Carta of American Environmental Law. And so I want to think about both of these, specifically the state-federal relationship around resource development, and then what ANCSA has meant to Alaska Native people, the development of our resources. So some folks at the time, including Governor Jay Hammond, actually argued that the passage of ANCSA was going to be more important for Alaska's long-term economy than oil would be, right? Which was a pretty provocative argument in the 1970s. And so I'm wondering, what role have we seen Native corporations play in Alaska's resource development over the past 50 years?
That's one thing I've really enjoyed watching progress. I was in the Oval Office on Energy Week when I was governor. 3 governors were invited to the Oval Office to talk about various projects, about the energy project. And so I brought up the gas line. And I remember President Trump asked, he said, well, how are you going to get past the opposition from the indigenous people? And I said, well, because they'll build it. They have gone. Our largest corporations in Alaska now are ANCs. I mean, Arctic Slope Regional Corporation, Doyon. It is one of the greatest success stories in Alaska is the ANCs as far as how they have grown. And now they're obviously all over the world, not just in Alaska and whatnot. So it is a unique. It's very unique in as far as how it came about, and I think Governor Hammond was absolutely right that will far outlive the benefits of TAPS. And
right.
So it's exciting to explain that to somebody because they just didn't have an understanding of that, and so.
Right, and Alaska was really ahead of the curve there. I know there are indigenous corporations in Canada that now have things like majority stakes in some of their LNG and pipeline projects. So in some way, Alaska really led the way.
Yeah, and we did.
Absolutely. And then, as you know well, and as the late Steve Haycox wrote about, Alaska has been the battleground between, the state and the federal government in terms of how will these resources be developed, right? Who controls natural resource development? We can go all the way back to, Cordova, right after the turn of the century, throwing coal in the water, people protesting the federal government locking up some of those coal lands. And so we have this larger dynamic, but then especially over the past 8 years, it feels like every presidential administration is this major seesaw back and forth, and Alaskans feel this viscerally, right? And so I'm wondering how you've seen the state-federal relationship concerning resource development change over the past 50 years?
Well, I mean, it's changed radically just in the last, the last elections. We're sort of the victim of this political volleyball back and forth about Alaska's resource development. Some want to lock it up, and some want to develop everything. When President Obama was coming to Alaska, I met him a couple of times, and he's actually from the same community as my wife, so they actually had a better connection than he and I did whenever we get together. But I wanted to fly up with him, and I did, because I wanted to help him understand Alaska, not in a, typically when you're in the presence of at least my experience in the Oval Office with the president, you've got about 10 seconds to get your point across, and with some a little less. So I wanted to, really help them understand Alaska, and so I did. I mean, it's from Andrews to Jay Bear, it's a long flight, and so in fact, when I talked my way onto the flight, they told me, and they said when the president comes up, you'll have a little bit of time. I said, well, how much? They said, well, meet the flight at Jay Bear, and then over to the Captain Cook. You can ride in the Beast. I said, well, I'll take about less than a minute at 80 miles an hour. All the streets closed. That's not enough. So I said, I'll fly up with him. And they said, are you here? I said, no, but I'll be there. They said, we've never had that request. I said, I never made that request before. So I got to tell you, climbing onto Air Force One, some punk kid from Carpenter from Valdez was a moment for me, a pretty emotional moment for me. But a friend of mine in the White House said, here's what you do when you go to Air Force One. They'll have your name plate at a sit down and stay there. Don't wander around and be creative, just stay there. So I did. And as soon as we leveled off, even before then, around the corner comes President Obama, and he said, hey, Governor, have you been on this bird before? I'm thinking, well, let me think. No, I don't think I've been on this bird before. So he said, well, let me show you around. And so he took me all through everything, and said, don't go through that door. That's where the press corps stays in that particular area, whatnot, But we had a chance to sit down and really talk about Alaska, whatnot, about the resource development, what the deal was, why we became a state, and whatnot. So we developed a relationship as a result of that. And the most dangerous part of an administration can be in the last days, because they were under significant pressure to do all they could do to close out more areas of Alaska for development. And Secretary Jewell and I did not see eye to eye on anything. Many meetings with her, but we just didn't see eye to eye on anything. And she actually called me on the last day and said, I wanted to tell you all the things we didn't do. And she gave a long list of things that they said no to, partly because our job is to help them understand Alaska and how unique and how different we are. Every state's different and unique, but we have some uniquenesses about it. So we have seen that. We have seen that sort of whipsawed back and forth between drill baby drill and drill nowhere, and we kind of try to live in that environment. And the concern I have is that the lifespan of litigation far exceeds the term of any particular president, or even 2 terms. Because if all you're doing is attracting more litigation, nothing really gets accomplished. I mean, it's great sound bites, great headlines, but if you don't go through the appropriate process, and that's what sometimes happens at the very end, they say, well, damn it, I want this done, and they do it, but they haven't gone through the various legal processes to do it right, and it gets kicked out, whatnot.
Sure.
So it's challenging moving forward on that. Anybody that's going to invest in Alaska, certainly industry as well, they want some sort of certainty. But if it's this whole back and forth, I know that a lot of it's pinned, and they say, well, the state needs to have that as well, and sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. But in the federal government, it is back and forth as far as how long this is going to stay in place until the next one.
Right, and that certainty matters not just for oil and gas, but things like renewable tax credits or critical minerals policies. So, and of course, Alaska is at the center of that as well.
Well, we looked at a challenge, basically condemnation that if a local government takes someone's property and says you can't do this on that property, or we're going to take the property for a new building. There's compensation associated.
Mm.
So if we can't develop our resources, there should be some sort of compensation associated with that. So we didn't get very far down the road on that, and hopefully that's sort of the last, the last bastion of hope when you get to that point. We'd much rather develop them responsibly, whatnot. But it is a huge challenge for a state that lives off of resources.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's talk about Alaska's experience as a resource state. I think earlier historians might have called it a resource colony. Going back before before statehood. Attorney General John Havelock called it riding the tiger, which was our relationship with the multinational oil industry. And Governor Egan, when he was governor for the second time in 1971, he said, quote, "The primary obligation of the oil companies involved is to stockholders in boardrooms in New York, Los Angeles, and Houston. Alaskans must be vigilant and forceful in the protection of their own interests. The sheer size of the enterprise in Alaska demands effective public control, or we will have an economic state larger and more powerful than the political state which contains it." Has Alaska been sufficiently vigilant and forceful in the protection of our natural resources?
I don't think we have, and for a number of reasons. And mentioning Governor Egan, I think, I'm not saying he didn't get enough credit. He got a lot of credit for a lot of things. But some of the things he said, and it was actually in Jack Roderick's book talking about, he said he worried about what 20 years down the road Alaska would look like, politically, as a result of having one large industry and whatnot. And so, I think that we have, we sort of lost our way a bit, I think, in as far as on resource development. And I read Lisa Weissler's book, Capital Crude. If you haven't gotten a copy of that, I strongly encourage you to read that. It's a great history of the taxation. I mean, I know that's kind of nerdy to get into, but the taxation of it. But what struck me was the vicious battles in Juneau early on about what the appropriate share was. I mean, it was knocked down, drag out on that, and you had people like Republican Tom Fink, fighting for higher taxes on the oil industry. I mean, higher shares of this or that, and so it was an interesting versus where we are today, and right. So we have shifted away from that. It's now that if you look at wanting to make any sort of adjustment, you are labeled as anti-oil. Mm-hmm. And that's just not right. That's not fair. And so I never have faulted the oil industry for anything that they've received. I always say, let's learn from them. If someone's doing something better than me, I want to learn from them. And that's actually how I hired Robin Brenna years ago, because he was on the opposite side of me on a case and didn't feel too comfortable. And so I hired him, and apparently later I fired him. He tells me that. I don't remember firing him, but I did. But so we could learn from what they do, and what they do so well, that's not to their fault. It's just that I ran. Senate Bill 21 was in the play. I was very much against that, and I just felt we didn't have somebody on our side of the table. Mm-hmm. And I know some people found that offensive, but I didn't think we did have somebody on our side of the table. When I saw Senate Bill 21 pass, and two of the votes were people that were full-time employees of the oil industry. I mean, you couldn't do that in the Fairbanks North Starborough. You couldn't do that in the city of Fairbanks. Any community in Alaska was preventing somebody from voting on it. And I was just horrified by that it passed by one vote, and it was such a large subsidy. What are we doing? What have we become? So that was really sort of the tipping point for me. Said, you know what, I guess I can't take this anymore. Mm. And that caused me to that and Governor Hickel at our family dining room table with Ermely beating the table saying, "You better run." He beats the table. You better do what he says. I found, so I did.
Well, I'm glad you did. Taking a step back, or maybe even thinking about the continuation of that question, there's a lot of scholarship on what's called the resource curse, right? These states that are endowed with abundant natural resources. Often this is oil, but what the resource curse says is, it's also known as the paradox of plenty, is the observation that many of these countries often experience lower economic growth, less democracy, and worse development outcomes than countries with fewer natural resources. So historically, people have said, well, Alaska has escaped the resource curse. And I don't know, I kind of look around and I see our schools closing. I see people leaving. Arguably, I see us not getting fair share for our resources. So has Alaska succumbed to the resource curse? Have we escaped it? Have we just delayed it? Is it too soon to tell?
Well, interesting you mentioned that. That's a term I didn't like. When I first heard it, I just thought that was very negative, whatnot, until I became governor. And my commissioner of revenue came to me about a month, Randy Hoffbeck, came to me about a month after I was in office, and he said, Governor, I got some bad news. I said, what, oil's at $10 instead of 26? Nope, oil's still at 26. But every sovereign, except Norway, that has lived off of resources, went completely broke before they made the turn. And making the turn meaning going back to, paying, through taxes or whatever. And I said, Randy, that's not possible. We got $20 billion in $20 billion in our various accounts, CBR, all the various accounts together, around $16, $20 billion. It's not possible. Well, we're down to about $1 billion now, a little under $1 billion. We have spent through that, rather than making the turn and going back to kind of what we used to do. I mean, Norway came into Alaska and looked at our model and adopted our model for about a year and a half and said, that's a terrible model. And they did their own model and they changed nothing. And their sovereign wealth fund is approaching $2 trillion. Their goal was $3 trillion. And they've just never touched that. But in Jay Hammond's book, one of his books, he said his biggest decision he regretted was not vetoing the bill that eliminated income tax. He said, it's going to be hell to pay for that governor that tries to reinstitute. I just didn't know I was going to be the governor that tried to reinstitute that. So that's the problem, is that, it's a non-renewable resource. It's a finite amount of resource. We manage our renewable resource. We manage fish, I think, quite well, because we know it has to be sustainable and that. But we don't acknowledge what on a non-renewable resource, it's a finite amount. I sat next to I was at a health, safety, and environment conference in Washington, D.C. as a guest of BP once. I was sitting next to a gentleman from Ohio. And he said, in his town, he said, we had a refinery there for years. It was the biggest employer of the town, and everything was great until one day everybody went to work and the gates were locked and there's a sign saying we're closed, and they were done. He said, just be aware that it's a finite, amount. And I think we're going to have. I just came from the Alaska Dialogue in Talkeetna. And there's a lot of discussion about how long oil and gas will be here. And I listen to people like Dave Norton and Tom Barrett, because they're closer to it than I. But maybe in the next, 50, 60 years, that's great. But let's make sure that we recognize that there is an end date. There's an expiration date on the resource extraction, that we are, for me, it's not getting necessarily the most money out of it, it's the most value out of it. And as an example, in Alberta, for years, there was a law that you could not export any raw materials from Alberta. It was against the law. You had to turn them at least one time.
Huh.
And so as we export, crude oil at large volumes, I mean, I think there should be a refined product that leaves. I mean, I think we need to make sure that we get all the value out. Somebody else, sometimes we're, we wanted to become not a colony, but we kind of are when you're exporting raw materials and somebody else gets those jobs. And certainly in the mining issue as well, and we need to bring down our cost of energy significantly to be competitive. That's our obligation. But I also think we need to make sure that we're bringing as much jobs and value out of it. But a concern I have, and my good friend Charlie Cole used to always say this in all the trials we were in together. He said, here's the deal. We have been underwater since 2012. You know, everybody says we're headed for a fiscal crisis. We've been in a fiscal crisis. Anytime you're spending more than you're making, in our personal lives, that would have been a crisis. You know, we talk about how Alaska responds well to a crisis, and we did. The 64 earthquake, the 67 flood. But this is a different kind of crisis. This is a lingering one that kind of quiet, kind of, you know, but as we watch that, the funds being spent down, since 2012 was the last year we had enough money to cover our costs. Ever since then, we've been drawing down on our savings, you know, $1 billion here, $1 billion there, and pretty soon it's pretty much gone. So, you know, we're kind of like frogs in a pot, and every year, you know, we turn it up a little bit more, and it doesn't feel that bad. We got through last year a little bit more, and so that's what concerns me. What happens when those are gone? I mean, you don't flip a switch and suddenly have more revenue. It takes 3 or 4 or 5 years for that to cycle in and whatnot. So that's what concerns me is that we have ignored the crisis. And, you know, I think, you know, part of my, you know, politically terrible decisions, but the decision that had to be made came from my time in Valdez. I mean, after the earthquake, I had to make some tough decisions. Not me as a 12-year-old, but I watched my parents, Marty's parents, you know, make some really tough decisions. And I just thought, that's part of the job. I mean, you've got to, you know, and as I said to the legislature and when I State of the State, I said, no, I ran for this job to do the job, not keep the job. And the day that I'm making decisions to keep the job, I need to resign, because then I'm working for a constituency of 1. And so I believe that, you know, and unfortunately we didn't have the legislature that we have now, didn't have a bipartisan legislature, and someone in one of the parties, which I won't name, wanted to make sure I didn't get a second term. And I said, look, I'm taking care of that myself. I got that under control, not my decisions. You don't need to worry about that. I got that. Let's just do what's good for the state, whatnot. So it was frustrating for me, because coming from the private sector, I was used to getting more done than we did. And I was very glad we got the POMV passed. I'm very happy about that. I was very glad that we got, you know, health care for 70,000 Alaskans that we're already paying for, and doing that brought the state budget down by about $1 billion. So there was some progress, but I'm just used to building buildings, and you just kind of, you know, you have a plan. You have to have a plan, and I've never excavated the ground without a plan. Used my brother Bob draws them up, and then we build the building. So that's what I was trying to do. Was trying to, you know, have our fiscal plan. But then we came to here in this building, and we brought 350 Alaskans together to talk about it. And as far as what are we going to do? And this is like 3 months into my term, and my staff came to me and said, well, if we do it at the university, how are we going to keep the media out? I said, how do you keep the media out? Insist that they be there. And we live streamed across the state. So somebody in the Unilink fleet, Igagik, could watch what we were doing in the various presentations, whatnot, that we had. So it was and we stayed in the dorms. And I said, no exceptions. And Bill Corbis came to me. He had just given, I think, $10 million as a donation to the city of Juneau for, you know, for the good of Juneau, whatnot. He came, he said, Governor, I need an exception. I said, oh, geez, that was my first, you know, backing up from what I said. And I said, what do you want? What? He said, any chance I could get the bottom bunk? Yes, Bill. I mean, you know, Bill was in his 80s. Yes, Bill, you can have the bottom bunk. That's it, you know. But we stayed in the dorms, and then we met here for 3 days. And I thought here, because this is where the Constitutional Convention took place. And I just, you know, and I just have a natural, obviously, and I've explained previously my affection for Fairbanks, but the University of Alaska Fairbanks is sort of where it all began in, you know, 1917 when it first began. So, but that was a great discussion, but we couldn't carry it through. We couldn't carry it through politically as far as what needed to be done, but we at least had the discussion. And I think that's important.
So important. I want to open it up to audience questions here in a moment. So think about your burning questions for the governor, but maybe a couple more quickly for you. You know, I think Alaska has a proud tradition of independent-minded people, independent-minded governors. I think of Governor Hammond. I think of Governor Hickel. I think of yourself. So maybe a couple questions here. Why do you think Alaskans are drawn to nonpartisan and independent candidates? And what do you think the effect of ranked choice voting has been on kind of depoliticizing or reducing political extremism in the state?
Well, let me do that in reverse. On the ranked choice voting, I certainly was in favor of that. But the most important part of it for me, I think, is the open primaries.
Mhm.
I just think that the threat of someone being primaried is real, and I think the best result. Just look at the Alaska legislature this last few sessions with the leadership, with the bipartisan coalitions we put together. You know, we had bipartisan coalitions in the past, and none of them got reelected. They got a lot done, but they didn't get because they were targeted, whatnot. And I just think that's wrong. I just think that we need to be able to elect people that we want to elect, and not necessarily. The primary was more important than the general election, because the primary really separated who was going to win in the general election. So I'm certainly in favor of ranked choice voting, and I would, yeah, I think we've seen the proof of the pudding on that. And thank you very much, Senate President Stevens, for all your help and leadership in Juneau. So I think that's critical that we have that, so we can get away from the tension of us versus them. And it's so, and I think that Alaskans generally are independent. I think the independents lean to the right fairly significantly. I think they're just maybe the right's gone too far to the right, and they're not quite there. But when you're an independent, and you governor, and I was the only independent governor in the nation when I was governor. They weren't sure how to deal with me in Washington. In fact, once at one of the dinners, the Governor Association dinners, the president, you go in and you find out what table you're at. I didn't even look at what table. I was just glad to be in the White House. I thought that was pretty cool. And then we looked, and we were seated. The Republicans here and the Democrats there, and we were seated with the president and the first lady. They didn't know what the hell to do with this. So then all the Republican governors glared at me. The Democratic governors glared, like, why does this guy from Alaska get to sit with the president and whatnot? So it's but also sometimes there are situations that both sides are unhappy with me. And I certainly had that. I understood that, because I felt my job was to make decisions. My job was to make hard decisions, and I made hard decisions. And so I think Alaska in general, I mean, we have the famous bumper sticker. We don't care how they do it outside or those kinds of things, whatnot. So I think generally we are, but not always on election day. Sometimes what happens with independence is that, the people on the Republicans, some like me, but we don't like the Democratic candidate, and the vice versa. The Democrat kind of like me, but they really don't like so they'll go to the respective corners on election day, and you kind of like, hey, where'd everybody go? And so there's that. That's a little bit. I really like the whole unity concept. I actually tried to promote that on a national level at one particular time when it looked like there was going to be someone was going to drop out, and I did a little bit of communication on the concept of the unity ticket. And when before Byron and I joined our campaigns, of course we checked with our respective running mates, and if either one of them had said, we don't like this, we wouldn't have done it. And they both said yes. We were down 8 points. And a week after we joined, we were up 22 points.
Wow.
It was because people went, wow, we've got a Democrat and a Republican move to the independent joining forces to work together. What a concept. And I think that's a great concept. I think absolutely. So I wouldn't have had it any other way. As far as, because I wanted to be the governor of a state, not the governor of a party. And so I think that was important. And, George Washington was our only independent president. And for that very reason, he said, I don't want to be the president of a party. So,
that's right.
So look how far we have shifted. I did a stint at Harvard after I was out of office. They asked me to be a fellow there, and had a class on bridging the partisan divide. And I had my first slide was a picture of Byron and myself, arms raised in the air on Inauguration Day, both of us on the stage together. And the next slide was Speaker Pelosi tearing up the speech of President Trump behind him. And I said, here's the two extremes. And maybe there's some place we can, how wrong I was there. We've continued on the other path, but I just think that's part of the problem is that social media allows us to talk about people, but not necessarily to people. We're not talking to each other. That's not a conversation. When you're just attacking the other person, whichever side, So I think that's really has blocked the progress that could have been made.
I agree.
Is that, you know, people just, the partisan divide continues to get wider.
Yeah, yeah. Well, maybe one more question and then we'll open it up to the audience. So really thinking about resource development, I'm thinking about all of the money that Alaska has taken from one-time oil dollars and invested it in renewable resources over the years. So Jay Hammond once said that, quote, Alaska's best long-term future lies with increased dependence on renewable resources. End quote. So over the past 50 years, Alaska has invested billions of dollars into improving and sustainably harvesting our renewable resources, from hydropower to tourism and fisheries. What are some examples you see of successfully investing oil wealth in renewable resources? And maybe part of this question is, what comes next for Alaska?
Well, I mean, certainly I think the best example in renewable resources is Kodiak. I mean, it's like 99.8% renewable, and then the point two is just that they have to keep some oil to exercise the backup diesel engines for that. But that's a good example of that. A fair number of hydro projects in Southeast. Has a big project there. So I think that there are examples in bouncing back to Norway a bit. What we learned when we were there is that all their energy is on renewables with hydro, and then they make their money off the non-renewables, and they live off of the renewable.
Sure.
And so they have made the full transition. There's more that we could do. The part of the problem is one of the reasons I ran for governor is I watched closely the throughput of taps continue to decline. In fact, my brother and I would drag around this whiteboard that showed the decline of taps, the throughput, because from 2.1 million barrels a day, now we're in the 400,000. We used to be able to fix the fiscal problem with a bump of the price of oil. At 2 million barrels, that works. At 400,000 barrels, that doesn't work at all. So my concern is that we're going off this fiscal side and not doing anything about it. So my point is, we kind of ran out of the kind of funding that we needed. I mean, the capital budgets that were available years ago, and Jim Sampson's certainly very familiar with that, didn't exist. The capital budget was just almost non-existent now. And so to be able to do these kinds of projects that we should be doing, where's the money going to come from? We have our deferred maintenance, and there's no ribbon cutting for deferred maintenance. There's no pictures taken, but it's $1.4 billion of deferred maintenance, and that continues to grow and grow and grow and grow. So, as a lot of folks say, we can build our way out of this. I have a wonderful bride of 50 years, nearly 50 years, and before I could start any new projects that I wanted to build out of the lake, she said, let's finish the ones here first, all the deferred maintenance I have had for all those years, and I did. I had to earn my way to the new project that I wanted. I'm a new project guy. And so, but it's the same thing. We have deferred maintenance all over the state. It's horrific, some of the deferred maintenance. It only gets worse. So, but you don't, that's not a sexy platform line to talk about that, quite honestly, but it's true. So to do more projects, to sit in a hydro project would have been a tremendous project, and there have been generations of people working on that project, and generations and generations, and it's a big dollar project. And I worry on the federal side. We now get about 47% of our revenue comes from the federal government. It used to be higher than that. That's a big risk. That's a big risk of what could happen on the federal side. So we have to look at ways of having sustainable energy and have low cost energy. And I tell you, I've often said that with Fairbanks, it should be the energy mecca of the state, with 400 miles from the North Slope, and having all the infrastructure Fairbanks has with the rail, with the river, with the roads, and with the air, and yet we don't have that. We don't have that low cost energy. And I've just been a big I've studied, obviously not much to study on it, is that every growing economy, thriving economy has one thing in common: they have low cost energy. And every struggling economy has the same thing, is that they have high cost energy. So we are in the most energy rich state in the nation, and the seventh largest in the world if we were a country, and yet we have the highest cost energy, and sometimes the dirtiest energy, and you know, so the air quality issues, whatnot. So that's what frustrates me, that we got wrong.
Yeah.
You know, that we got wrong, and quite honestly, I'm not sure that's being readjusted as we speak.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's, how about a big round of applause for the governor? Love to open this up to you all and questions you have. I have more questions. I didn't get through my questions. You guys all know how this goes, right? The opportunity to talk to the governor. You want to ask a million things, but let's open it up here. We've got 20 minutes or so, and let's have a robust conversation.
Hi, this is Ray Bonnell, and this isn't a question, it's a comment about Valdez. From my perspective, as my family being from Cordova, and as many of you know, Cordova is just around the corner from Valdez in Prince William Sound, and there is a camaraderie between the two communities. In fact, Valdez businessmen were instrumental in getting Cordova established back in the early 1900s. However, there was also a certain amount of rivalry between the communities, especially between the basketball teams. I don't know whether you've ever looked at a map, but Valdez is located in Valdez Arm, at the head of Valdez Arm. If you look at a map, Valdez Arm is actually sort of shaped like an arm, and there's an elbow, and it led to the nickname in Cordova, at least among the high school kids, of Valdez being the armpit of Alaska. That's it.
All right.
Well,
Question,
let me just say, I'm a proud Valdez Buccaneer. Marty was the cheerleader, and we enjoyed our time in Cordova immensely, especially whenever we'd win and beat the Wolverines. So anyway, we love Cordova, and yeah.
Hi, my name is Glenn Seaman. Governor, would you comment on what seems to be the current approach for the gas line of a private developer doing it instead of the state, in context of some of the discussion you already had?
How much time do we have left?
You know, so we have more time than I expected. We have about 45 minutes. Yeah.
Thank you for that question. You know, obviously I have followed it very, very closely. I got involved in it almost within weeks of when oil came into Valdez, and you know, Paso was looking at bringing a pipeline back then. So it's been a long history, and so I have a strong opinions about how it should be done. Here's the problem. First of all, transparency. You know, the contract that's been entered into right now, who's seen it? You know, what do we know? I mean, I get calls every day, people saying, should I invest in double the size of my business? What should I do to get ready for the gas line? I go, I don't know. I mean, because we haven't seen what the deal is. We should see what the deal is. That should not be held confidential. You know, I had a saying that because you had the right to do something doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. And that there is a provision in the law that allows them to keep that during negotiations. Negotiations are over. We need to see what the deal is. We need to be able to evaluate it. We need transparency in this state on all resource development. All resource development. We need transparency. You know, and so to answer your question, I'm worried. I'm worried that we gave an asset between what Exxon, BP, and ConocoPhillips in the state of Alaska put into that. It's close to $1 billion asset, and we turned it over with nothing down, not a penny down. We turned it over to a company. I don't know them well. I'm not going to badmouth them. I'm going to tell you what I know about them. It's a group of New York investors that have two other projects that have not started in Texas, and so we've turned it over to them to do this massive project. And I'm all about the private sector because I come from the private sector. But there are times when the government should stay involved to make sure. I would have transferred it over at final investment decision, not now. I would see it through the final investment decision, and if you can do it, you can do it. You're not. But to completely turn it over at this stage and let you go out and develop it, right now, I think we're number 3 in their book. They just announced that they had hard customers in one of their Texas LNG projects, but here we just have press releases, letters of intent and intentions and stuff like that. So I'm very, very worried that we missed a tremendous opportunity in 2016. In 2016, the U.S. had zero export. We were have zero export of LNG, and between 2016 and 2020, we went from 0 to the #1 in the world of exports. We missed that wave, and we had, customers were involved. Marty was involved, and that all changed at the election, at the gubernatorial election. Someone came in and said, "I don't like the project. I don't want it to happen." And now it's sort of Johnny come lately. He's trying to catch up on stuff, and so all those customers we had all went to the lower 48 to get their supplies. So I worry about that a lot, because and what haunts me is I know what it would do, done properly, for the cost of energy in Alaska. It should be a distance-sensitive rate, so people in the interior are paying a lesser amount than the people further south, because the pipeline only comes 400 miles through this area. I think there's an intentional decision to bypass Fairbanks, and I think it's an intentional decision to bypass Valdez, because we stood up and said, "Hey, on the TAPS evaluation,
Right.
You don't give the control of siting and those kinds of things to companies that are not going to build it." And we knew that when they came to me at the very second meeting I had with our owners, me as governor, 1/4 owner of the project, Exxon, BP, and Conoco there. They said, we want to put this on the shelf for now and mothball it unless you want to take it over. And I couldn't say yes fast enough. I've been waiting for that opportunity, for 30 years, for the state to sort of get in the driver's seat on this thing and do it in such a way that Alaskans truly benefit from it. That's all changed, and it's gone back, and I would say in sort of we see lots of headlines. I want to see the contract. I want to see what have we agreed to do if they don't. We know what we did with TransCanada. When they didn't develop, we had to buy our way back out. What is it going to cost now? We have a lot less money. So honestly, I have to say, for the first time in my life, I don't know, because we have turned it over in a secret document for somebody else who doesn't have any connection to Alaska.
Right.
So
Right.
it's very frustrating for me to have to answer a question that way, based on all that's been done to date. I mean, we've had the Port Authority did work on. I mean, there's been lots of different things tried, but I think I can't. I always try to, glasses half full kind of guy. I'm gonna have a hard time on this one until I see that contract, until it becomes public. The legislature should have that contract, because if there's provisions in there that requires the state to buy it back, what's the dollar amount for that? Where are we gonna get the money to do that? So I mean, I was horrified to find that we transferred that over with nothing down. I mean, you wouldn't sell a car that way. But that's what we've done, and I think it's scary.
Yeah, and just to step back historically, and I had a question that I want to come back to about this. I think some people's eyes glaze over when you start talking about pipeline tariffs and things like this, but this has been so phenomenally important for the state. So from a historical perspective, as you know well, Governor, Alaska did not do a very good job of regulating the tariffs, which are the amount that you pay to move oil down the pipeline. We did not do a very good job of regulating the tariffs on TAPS. And if we would have just regulated those tariffs properly, I'm not talking about taxes, just the tariffs, the permanent fund would be something like twice the size today, right? Because we lost out on close to $10 billion, that much of that would have been invested and that would have grown. And so, things like contracts and, all of this, I think some folks say, well, let's just get this gas line going. We'll figure that all later. I think that's one of the most important lessons from TAPS is the devil is really in the details. These players, these big multinationals, these companies know the details very well. As you and I have talked about, more often than not, the state has been outmaneuvered by these companies. So it's really important to get the details right.
Well, and you're right, Bill, but I don't blame them for outmaneuvering us. That's what they're supposed to do. That's their job. They have that fiduciary obligation to their shareholders to do that. It's just that we need to be on our side of the table equally prepared and have the right people there to be able to say that's interesting, but you don't get that anyplace else in the world. Name one place that will subsidize you to the tune that we subsidize you, and they can't raise their hand because there's no place else that does that. So that's the concern I have, is that we just sit back, and I know we've had one particular governor said, you know, what's good for the oil industry is good for us. Not always, you know, and because somebody does their job better than we do, I just don't fault them. We just need to do our job better and be bold enough to stand up and be Alaskans again. I guess my problem, and maybe it's I've been here so long, is I remember when we used to do that. You know, I remember we used to do that as a state, and over time, that has shifted and shifted and shifted, and you know, I mean, Governor Palin, whether you like her or not, she probably did more on oil taxes than any governor. It doesn't hurt that you had the FBI kind of singing in the background with her as well. That was part of it as well. But that's where the surplus, the $16 billion came from, was from ACEs. And so, you know, that went away. But so we've had, you know, and Marty was certainly in the administration on that. And again, everybody's branded as anti-oil if you stand up for Alaska. And that's just wrong. I mean, we're not anti-oil, we're just pro-Alaskans.
Yeah, thank you. Other questions for the governor?
Thank you, Governor, for a very informative discussion here. My name is Rich Mattson, and I just have a question on a personal basis. As a leader of a great state, how does a person in a position like you choose your staff to get you the information you need to make these hard decisions? You're covering everything from big policy issues like we're talking about with TAPS, down to somebody in a village that's asking about help for a domestic crisis or little things. You cover a whole scope of incredible decisions to make, from little teeny one-on-one personal decisions to, you know, decisions that'll affect not just the state, but the nation and even the world. How does a person like yourself approach all these things?
Well, here's how was my philosophy. I went after most of the people that worked for me didn't apply. I went to them and said, I need your help. And they said, well, I'm not sure I want to take that big of a financial sacrifice. I said, no, you need to. You've got kids, you're going to have grandkids, you need to do that. And I sort of shamed them into that. Some told me no several times. I kept going back to them and saying, no, you're the person that I want. And so I did. And one individual I really wanted was an example was Mike Navarre in Kenai. He ran radio ads against me when I was running. And he said, did you not hear those ads? I said, oh, I heard the ads, Mike, but I really want you to be part of the team. And because I wanted to put together the best team of a lot, because as an independent, I wasn't welded to one end or the other. The whole state was equal. And so I sought out people that I felt were the best for the job. And when multiple people would apply, I would evaluate which one would be the best for Alaska. But then I sat down with them and said, here's the deal, as Charlie Pold would say. Here's the deal. You and your department. And they said, well, what about the media? I said, well, if the media calls, talk to them. Well, do you want everything to go through you? I said, absolutely not. You know, you're there because this is your area of expertise, and I want you to answer those questions. Well, should we run the answers by you? I said, no, don't run the answers by me. Just answer the questions and run your department. And I said, I expect you'll make some mistakes. I hope you do, because that means you're working hard, you're making some tough decisions. So don't be worried about making a mistake and I'm going to fire you. You know, it's more likely I'd fire you if you weren't making mistakes, you weren't doing anything. So, you know, we're in a crisis situation, so we need to respond accordingly. So I think the key is I mean, it's never a matter of being the smartest one in the room. I've never claimed that, and nor could I, nor would I. It's a matter of surrounding yourself with people. You know, I didn't look at as much their resume. I looked at their heart. Where's their passion? You know, you can't train passion. You know, either you have it, or you don't have it. And so, so I was very blessed with who I was surrounded by, because we all shared the same passion. And you know, when I made my decision to suspend my campaign in that terrible week in October, when I went back to my office from across the street from the Denina, you know, my entire cabinet was there, and they just stood and applauded and applauded. They knew that they were all out of a job as a result of the decision I made, and they were so appreciative of their time, I guess, that we had together. I was really fortunate to have who I had. So I guess the point is, surround yourself with people that not necessarily have the best resume, but also you can sense talking to somebody where their heart is, and where their passion is, and if they're willing to take risks for the betterment of the state, not just stay there as long as you can to receive a paycheck. That's who you want, and so that's how I made my decision. I did that same when I was putting people on the Supreme Court, and I'm so glad that Chief Justice Carney is going to be speaking to you. One of the criticisms when I was going to select her, someone said, well, then the Fairbanks would have 2 Supreme Court justices, my good friend Dan Winfrey, and now Chief Justice Carney. I said, and what's wrong with that? You know, what's the problem with that? They said, well, they're going to have to remodel the courthouse for her. I said, take it out of my budget. You know, and that's fine. But I don't, you know, when I interviewed her, and I wish she was here, because you know, she was not my top pick. You know, our process in selecting judges is that we'd have the Attorney General, we'd have, you know, various cabinet members there and whatnot, and we'd always have a non-attorney there as well. And we go around and interview. And when I got done listening to her, she's the one. I just felt it from her compassion for Alaska, and the decision. You know, if somebody comes out of Harvard, you know, graduate from Harvard Law, you can be in the 7-digit, you know, pay scale in large law firms. And she chose to be a public defender all those years. And of course, she was a basketball player too. That didn't hurt at all.
Other questions for the governor?
Thank you for your comments. My name is Zane Treesh, and I have a question as far as building renewable resources, or the infrastructure for renewables with solar panels, those kind of things. And my question specifically is the mining industry in Alaska. We still have gold, we still have silver, we still have copper, we still have the rare earths. What's your perspective on the mining industry in Alaska going forward to try to provide some of these raw materials for what the world's looking for to build these renewable systems or whatever?
Well, good question. I'm very bullish on mining. Actually, our father was a miner as well. Worked out in Platinum, Good News Bay, in a placer mine out there for years, early on, before any of us kids showed up. Mining is a very critical part of our economy, and it should be going into the future. You know, on rare earth metals, we are one of the largest in the world as far as what we have. We need access to them. We need access, but we need to do it in such a way that the local residents feel like they're involved. And let me give you a quick example. There's a mine on Admiralty Island called Sundance Mine, and first name is Bob, I don't remember his last name, but when he went there, he sat down in the community and said, I'm thinking about having a mine here. Please come and talk to me about it. And so they sat down around a pot of coffee for 3 or 4 hours, and he said, what's your biggest concerns? What's this and what's that? And then he took note of that, and he built his mine accordingly. It's a relatively small mine. They make gold bars the exact weight that's valued at $50,000 on that day, and then they mail them to Fairbanks because that's where the gold is sold here. And the local community has embraced that mine significantly because they were involved in it to begin with. So sometimes in our development, we race into it, buy land, and get it all planned out, and then say, here's our plan, what do you think? You've got your 3 minutes, as I said before. And that just, I don't think that's the right way to do it. I think you need to, I mean, a good example, I think, is the Red Dog Mine. And I love the relationship of the Red Dog Mine, you know, with the Native Corporation owning a 50% interest in it. When you go to that mine, it's a very different feel when you go into that facility. I mean, there's a lot of indigenous art on the walls. It just has a different feel to it. Because I went to every mine when I was governor, because I wanted to. I enjoyed that immensely. And so we have a tremendous opportunity in the mining area. I look for ways of eliminating the litigation. And here's the example I'm going to use about how to do that. So that's impossible. When Governor Hickel and Governor Egan were out of office, when they ran against Governor Hammond won. The next day he sat down with them and said, "You guys work on the gas line." He said, you know, "I'll take everything as you work on." So they did. They created the Yukon Pacific Corporation. What they did to do a gas line from Prudhoe Bay to Valdez, they went to the environmental community, Jeff Lowenfels, and said, we're going to have an office for you, and we want you to put somebody in that office of your choice, but under one condition, that you participate with us in our discussions. We don't want you to sign a non-disclosure. We don't want you to sign, you can sue us if you want, but be part of the discussion. So when we're going to have this river crossing or that river crossing, we know how you feel about it. When they got done, they went to the public hearings for the environmental impact statement around the state. They carpooled, the president of Yukon Pacific and the environmental community carpooled to Glenallen and Delta and around the state for these hearings. There was not one piece of litigation filed because there was engagement early on and said, you know, we know you're going to be watching this. You might as well watch this within the House rather than wait till we come out with something. So I think there's ways of engaging. You know, that may be a bit naive in this day and age because that was back in the 70s and 80s, but I think the litigation, the time involved in the litigation is what's really a problem. I've always felt that the state we should start the process itself. We should start the permitting process ourselves. It's kind of like a furnished apartment versus a vacant apartment. If all the time is spent trying to get furniture in the apartment so you can use it, we should that lower risk significantly. So I think there are things that we can do to somewhat de-risk some of these projects, such that it all by us permitting say on sort of how it all works, you know. And I know some mines in Alaska have been very controversial because it happens so fast. You know, by the time you find out what's happening, there's really not much you can do. So I think there's a different process we could do.
If I can follow up on that, because, and this goes back to what we were talking about before with consultation and, you know, what we've seen in the first, you know, 3/4 of a year of this presidential administration, you know, there is clearly an intense desire to accelerate resource extraction in the state. We saw Trump's executive order on the first day of office. But one of the things that surprises me and confuses me a bit, and I'd love to get your sense of it, is we are seeing right now the attempted revocation of the Central Yukon Management Plan, right? So this is a management plan where people have commented on it for years and years, and this isn't just miners or conservationists, it's local peoples. And, you know, I think there is this sense that if we do away with this process, it will accelerate resource development. But then I'm just thinking about your comments about it's so important to get the local consultation of people in these projects. And so I'm just wondering if maybe you can comment about what you've seen in the past 6 to 9 months with the Trump administration around this. And, you know, is this something that's ultimately going to backfire because we're taking away people's voices?
Well, typically it always backfires because you can't step over the litigation process. And, you know, and I look at a compact that's been worked on for years with all parties involved, and then all of a sudden it goes away. What message does that send as far as somebody coming to Alaska to invest millions of dollars in a project if suddenly this process goes away and now we're back in the litigation mode? That never goes away. And so the problem with going in and just arbitrarily almost just eliminating something that's been in place for a long time, it's very disruptive to the process. And if you don't, you know, if you really truly want to develop something, continue the process that's there, maybe make it better, but completely throw the whole thing out and just with a stroke of a pen and say it's not there anymore, that moves us back. I think that moves us away from resource development, not towards resource development. And it's a great soundbite, but it's terrible if we really want to actually develop something, responsibly. And again, I emphasize responsibly. I think things can be developed responsibly. This gold mine I mentioned in Adam Free Island, Sundance mine, they leave 8% of the gold in the ore. And the reason for that is they'd have to use chemicals to get it out. And the community said, we didn't want chemicals. He said, okay, so we leave 8% in. So what? We don't make as much money as we thought we were going to make, but that's fine because the community was heard early on, and we factored that into our financial planning and whatnot. So I think that I can't overstate. One company approached me when I was out of office. They wanted to do a mine out of Nome, and they wanted me to be on their board and this and that. And I said, well, so what have you done so far? It's, well, we did get this letter of resolution of opposition from the local Native organization. I said, I'm out. You've missed the step. Once you lose the trust, you have to build the trust. You can lose that trust in a moment. You already lost that. So now you're battling uphill. I'm not going to be part of that. Whatnot.
So important.
Phil, question. Governor, and by the way, Phil, you've done a fantastic job on this. Amazing. My name is Karen Perdue. I'm from Fairbanks, proudly from Fairbanks. My understanding is it's called Valdez, but I could be wrong about that. And Kordunka, yeah. I want to ask you about the people resources of Alaska. And thank you for appointing me to the Board of Regents. I think sometimes I'm not so happy, but we've had a wild ride. But we have about 22,000 students in the system right now, working their way through their education from career and technical education to PhDs. And we are part of the future of the state, and we're part of the past. And you can see from having professors that study energy policy how important it is for us to learn. So anyway, this is kind of a softball question to you about the role of the University of Alaska system in the economic makeup of the state. And as governor, how did you view the University of Alaska in all of that effort?
Well, thank you very much for accepting my appointment of you on the Board of Regents. It was a very tumultuous time to be on the board, and you didn't always smile at me afterwards when we see each other for that reason. So thank you very, very, very much, Karen, for being willing to participate in that. Our education system is really from pre-K through the university is so critical. Texas has an endowment, education endowment, and it started like in 18 something or other. And it's built up, and all the education funding comes from that endowment. It doesn't go through a legislative process. It doesn't get vetoed. It doesn't do this. It doesn't do that. And we should have done that. I think we can still do that. Have an education endowment for that, because what people don't fully understand, and I didn't fully understand certainly, is the amount of money that the university system brings to Alaska. Tremendous amount of money to Alaska. I'm so thrilled that Pat Pitney is the president. My kudos to the board for that, because I think she's phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal in every respect. So I think it is one of our major drivers is the university system in Alaska. And so I don't know how when I went through the Geophysical Institute over here, oh my goodness, what an amazing facility that is. And we're on the cutting edge of so many different things that just because of where we are. And so I think it's sort of the unsung hero of the state is our university system. But I strongly feel I'm so tired of the education funding battle that goes on. It shouldn't go on. I think we need to have an endowment, education endowment. I have some thoughts of where that might come from, so that it's the uncertainty even in education is I've talked to a number of families that have left Alaska with their kids because they were just concerned about the education system. They didn't know. All they saw was the uncertainty of the funding. Teachers without a retirement. The tenure as far as being here a couple of years and moving on. we need to get the education right, and I think we can do it. The university is a great example of getting it right, because it really has driven our economy. And I look at the number of folks that work in the industry in Alaska that are University of Alaska graduates, whatnot. So, and again, thank you very much for your service as a Board of Regents. Thank you.
Uh-oh, question from the brother. This is going to be good.
Full disclosure, I'm Bob Walker, Bill's brother. And I attended the university in my freshman year. And in fact, I remember Brian over there is a chancellor. But basically, what I'm concerned about is the transient nature of the population of Alaska. When somebody says they're going home for Christmas, you presume that was Cordova or Nome or Fairbanks or Anchorage or wherever. But in many cases, it's Scranton, Pennsylvania, for instance, or other states. And I would appreciate if you would address the positive nature of the transient population in various parts of the state, and also the negative.
Well, later my brother gave me the hardest question. Well, we do have a big turnover in Alaska. I was surprised to see that. I think Alaska is not for everyone, obviously, and in some respect, we're glad it's not, because some people just aren't a good fit for Alaska. But the concern I have is that, I think you find deeper roots in Fairbanks than you do perhaps in other parts of the state, in generationally, and I'm looking at CB as I say that, and Karen and others, and I'm concerned that they don't think long term. They think, there's a term called harvesting in sovereign oil countries. The term that the companies that are there never want to hear is the word harvest, because if the sovereign hears the word harvest, that means that they're just here for what they can get, and they're going to go on, and they usually will tax them very, very heavily. Actually, here in Alaska, one of our oil companies is called Harvest Alaska, strangely enough. They don't seem to care. But we have that mentality a bit with some Alaskans, and I don't know what the percentage is, but they're just sometimes a concern about what can I get for my own pot of gold, so to speak, so I can buy a bigger. And I heard from these folks. Believe me, when I did what I did on the permanent fund, I heard from folks that one person said, "Look, I really am upset with you." There's somebody I met working. She was working in Delta, and I said, "Well, you're not the only one." And I said, "Why are you upset?" She said, "Well, because on the permanent fund we have 14 children, and we came from Russia specifically because of the dividend program. And now what are we supposed to do?" Well, I was not shedding any big tears for her situation, but if and another group said, "Well, we're investing in family property in a foreign country, and we're going to have a hard time, being able to do that now." That's not the kind of Alaskans that are going to be concerned about the education system or those kinds of things, whatnot. So it is a problem. I think I hope we have in Alaska that people want to stay and say, "This is where I want to raise my family. This is where I want to educate them in the university system." So we need to make sure that we have things in place so they will stay. I do worry about the out-migration of folks, because those that are out-migrating now are out-migrating for reasons associated largely with education. And that's why we got to fix the education system and give it the stability that we used to have, that we don't seem to have now, just because all the ups and downs on the budget. And by the time, and thank you very much for overriding the veto, Senator. I thank you very much for I had to your leadership in that, and your pushback on that. I mean, you and House Speaker Edgman wrote some incredible communications and I think that gave backbone to the to other legislators to stand up and do the right thing on that. But by the time that's done, they've already laid off some teachers. And now they go and try to bring them back again, and they can't find them. They've gone someplace else or something, and it just sends the wrong message whatnot. So stability in education is absolutely, I think, key to slow the out-migration from Alaska. And, you know, those of us with kids and grandkids, it's heartbreaking when we see them out-migrate, and we are worried that they don't come back and whatnot. So I was just having that conversation with my friend Jim Sampson over here last night about that we always worry when they, certainly when they go to school outside, that they might not come back and whatnot. And let me just mention that this is a digress for a moment. When the deciding vote was made on TAPS in Congress, you know, Spiro Agnew was the one that made that vote. When that day, we were pouring concrete at the hospital in Valdez, and there were 3 laborers standing there waiting for the Harris to show up with a concrete truck. And it was myself, Jim Sampson, and Mano Fry. So the 3 of us were standing there with our shovels, and I pulled my pickup over next to the forms on the sidewalk and told, you know, John Harris, get out of the truck, come on over here, listen to this. And I don't think John was even old enough to drive at that point. And so the 4 of us stood there and listened to that vote on Spiro Agnew. And little we know that John would go on to become the Speaker of the House for a number of terms. Jim Sampson would be, you know, Commissioner of Labor, Legislature, Mayor of Fairbanks Borough a couple of times, and Mano would be the President of the FLCIO, and as Jim Sampson was, and I will become governor. That little foursome, listening to that vote of Spiro Agnew. And sorry, I digress.
You all fared better than Spiro Agnew. Yeah. I want to ask you, I love this question about transiency and thinking about investing in Alaska's long-term best future. And I think about Jay Hammond. He talked about the desire to promote homecomers, right? People who saw Alaska as home for multi-generations. And obviously we can talk about the big split here between indigenous peoples who have always felt that way and the settler populations who have come in. But maybe I'd love to get your perspective on a counterfactual. Historians usually don't like to talk about counterfactuals. We say it rarely illuminates history, but my mind goes back to Hammond's original dividend plan based on longevity and the Zobel v. Williams legal decision. What do you think Alaska would be like if that conception of the dividend as based on the amount of time you had been here was not overturned? If we still had that today, what would Alaska be like?
Well, let me just mention that was the part that tripped it up, was the retroactivity. You know, because of equal protection, you have similarly situated people treated differently. Believe me, I could do the math. I was pretty excited about that $50, you know, in the rearview mirror. I'm 1951 in Fairbanks. On forward, that was going to be a pretty good payday. But that's what tripped it up. If it hadn't been for that provision, you know, it would not have been struck down by the Supreme Court. Well, what Hammond said about that, of course, it was $50 a year for every year you lived in Alaska. And he said, you know, it's not like it's going to go up to, I think he said, you know, several $100s. Well, now here we are. I think the statutory one would be about probably $4,000 or $5,000 this coming year. So, so I think, I don't know that people really have moved. I mean, I've heard examples of people that have moved to Alaska for the dividend, but I don't think that's in mass. I think there are some exceptions to that, whatnot, a few, whatnot. But I think that the problem is that we're disconnected with our economy, and we aren't connected. You know, people pay more attention that goes on in the city of Fairbanks and the Fairbanks North Star Borough because they pay taxes, and then what goes on in Juneau, and they sort of kind of give the legislature the grade based upon the size of the dividend and whatnot. And so the legislature has been very courageous in the adjustments that they have made since. I mean, actually, I paid the last full dividend was
Right.
mine. I mean, as far as when
2015,
when I was in
yeah.
office. So I realized we were slipping significantly downhill, whatnot. So I think we do have the and Mike Navarre, Commissioner Navarre, and Larry Priestley used to do a presentation, a slide presentation around the state. It's called the Great Alaskan Disconnect. That we're disconnected from our state services because we expect, and we've had this history of something coming along and saving us. Something's going to come along and save us. And if you wait long enough, something's going to, and I don't think it's coming. I think we're done with that. I mean, that'd be great. Only it's the problem, because we had this problem in the 80s and almost reinstituted everything, and then everything spiked up and away we went. So yeah, it's you know, I hope we don't become Norway's the poster child of how to develop your resources. Alaska's the poster child of how not to develop your resources. I hope we don't become that. We don't have to, but I'm afraid we're, in some respects, we're sort of heading in that direction.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe one more question.
Actually, CB Bettisworth, Governor, to follow up on this conversation, I wrote a piece that was in the newspaper here a month ago. It was titled "No Skin in the Game," and that's exactly what you're talking about. Alaskans don't pay any taxes, so we don't have any ownership, so we don't care about sticking around. So, in my mind, Alaskans need their skin in the game.
Thank you for that, for writing that piece for the paper. And you know, we just came from Talkeetna to talk about the owner state, and we talked about what kind of a grade we'd give ourselves as owners. And I give us a very bad grade as owners, because here's the problem: we don't act like owners. We act like we're tenants, and we don't lead, we follow, and that's our fault. That's not anybody else's fault. So I think that when you interject the political process as the owner state, when a rancher in Texas or Montana is getting double the revenue off of their land on resource development than we are, we're just not. We're afraid to stand up and be Alaskans again. Is the concern, because you'll be labeled as something. And certainly, if you're in an elected position, you'll be labeled as something as anti-resource development, and nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, Clem Tillian used to always say his big push against Pebble Mine wasn't the fish, it was the money. He wasn't getting money out of it. And Clem Tillian was about as big of a fish. He was the fish czar for Hammond and major into fish. But he said, it wasn't the fish that concerned me. It was we just don't get that much revenue and whatnot. So I think we're afraid of rocking the boat. We're afraid someone's going to leave. And I thought that until I saw Conoco leave, but not because of us, because of their brethren in the industry that was. So I think we need to feel comfortable asking, and not uncomfortable questions, appropriate questions. And there's a committee that's formed, a commission on competitiveness to make sure that we're competitive. Where's our committee? Where's our committee that we are are we on a world scale? Where do we fit of our I don't really like the term our fair share. It's the resource is 100% our resource, and so whatever the severance is, it's not a tax, it's our share, and we go from 100% down to 12.5%. To get it developed. Is that the appropriate amount? I don't know. But elsewhere, I seem to be doing a whole lot better than we are. And maybe if we do that, we just get rid of this whole tax system. Get rid of all the subsidies. Just make it simple. Make it very simple. When a barrel of oil comes out of the ground, we get this percentage of it, you get that percentage of it, and have a great day. That's it. You could lay off 35 auditors and about 100 attorneys if we did that. So we just make it simpler and learn from what other sovereigns have done very, very well, and nobody left. Nobody left because of that. So,
yeah.
Where I was focusing my question was actually on the citizens of Alaska. The citizens don't have any skin in the game because they don't pay any taxes.
yeah.
And because they don't have any ownership. They don't have, they don't feel like they are part of this state.
Yeah.
And if they did, then they wouldn't be so eager to go.
Well, you're absolutely correct. No, there is no, without ownership, and that's what concerns me on the gas line. We've given it to somebody with no ownership, no skin in the game, zero. And I think that's the disconnect that we have, and that's why there is a connection between the residents of Fairbanks and the city of Fairbanks and the Fairbanks North Star Borough, because they have skin in the game, because they feel that it's their money that's being spent, and it is. Whereas on the state level, there just is not that engagement, and And the only way to get it back is to invite them into the process. But it's you know, as Governor Hammond said, it's going to be hell to pay to make that happen. What they should have done, they should have brought it down and just left it there at zero, not suspended it, but not eliminated it. That way you'd have that lever to pull. I was on a call with a governor's call one day with the Western governors. We just have every 2 weeks, just governors, no staff, whatnot. And Doug Ducey was on from Arizona. He said, "Hey, I got to get off. I got a hole in my budget." I say, "Doug, how big's your hole?" "Oh, it's $20 million. I said, "Well, mine's $4 billion." And he said, "Well, you're gonna have to raise taxes." I said, "What taxes? We don't have any taxes." So I mean, that sort of shows the magnitude of the difference of what happened. So, yeah, I mean, we need to come up with a mechanism that that brings them back into be part of it. So,
And if I can think about this historically, if I could recommend one thing that people read to think about this issue, it would be Terrence Cole's paper, Blinded by Riches. And I think he does a fantastic job of talking about the first time we enacted an income tax in the territory in 1949. And that was a down payment, a sign of the political maturity of the people that we were ready for statehood and that we were ready to pay for our own way. And in so many ways, I think about the state today, and I think we're right back in the 1940s when it comes to resource extraction without leaving, maybe not our share here, we don't have to say fair share, our share here when it comes to not having that tax connection between us and our government. And so, you know, I wouldn't be a good professor if I didn't give you all a homework assignment to leave from here. So I highly recommend that paper. And maybe, Governor, if I can just ask you, well, you know what? We are right at time, so try to keep it timely. Let's get a huge round of applause for Governor Walker.